I want to shift gears slightly because I think when I had emailed you earlier in the week, I mentioned that I wanted to ask you some sort of general questions about history. You're unfortunately or fortunately our resident historian, left-wing historian. So I guess, and I think I had said this to you in my email. Basically, like a few years ago when Eric Foner's book Gateway to Freedom came out, I went to a talk by him and he said something through the course of his talk. He said something like, well, like I really respect and I like Howard Zinn, but I don't subscribe to his vision of history, which is that people rise up and then they get beaten down. And I thought that was really interesting. And Foner, was like, my view is actually like slightly more optimistic. And I thought that was so interesting. And I, also love and respect Howard Zinn. Like many people, A People's History of the United States was sort of my like teenage, entry into left-wing history. We all know that A People's History of the United States has spawned a million A People's History of X, Y, and Z. But I'm wondering, I mean, as somebody who's, fully entrenched in the discipline of history, what are kind of the main schools of, I guess you would say, left-wing history that we see right now? And like, where do you situate yourself within that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think one way to look at Zinn is a sort of a slightly, this is probably too cute, it doesn't line up perfectly, but one way to think about Zinn is that Zinn represents both the strengths and the weaknesses of a kind of new left approach to history, or at least one strand of that is, intensely, focused on, social movements, and identifies, social movements from below as the kind of source of any kind of movement toward, equality in America, but is also sort of almost, resoundingly pessimistic about the capacity for those movements to really attain victories. And I think there are things to be learned from, the way that Zinn, treats a lot of these struggles. Absolutely. And to some extent, the way that Zinn recognizes the sort of remorselessness and the entrenched power of ruling class interests in this country's history. There's no gainsaying that either. But I'm not of the Zinn school. I mean, and I think I'm closer to Foner because I think, it's not surprising that Foner would see it this way, because for me as a historian of the Civil War era, like Eric, this is where Zinn's interpretation, at least one place, I think there are others, the New Deal and to some extent the Civil Rights Movement, falls apart in that, in the narrative of Zinn's book, much like actually older schools of sort of progressive history, non-Marxist progressives like, Charles Beard, and to some extent, actually, in very old school, Marxist and communist historians, early accounts in the sort of first half of the 20th century, the Civil War was basically a conspiracy of industrial capitalism to sort of break apart a feudal remnant that, a feudal remnant that had, kind of attached itself to the national state and needed to be shattered for the forces of, capitalist modernity to surge through the country. And emancipation was kind of an afterthought and an accident. And, in Zinn's account, this, comes with much more emphasis on the struggles of enslaved people themselves, and is sort of less about the sort of robotic working out of sort of, invincible economic forces from above. But both of those stories kind of rhyme. Whereas I think the story that, Foner has told, and the story that I would tell in my work that I've, some of it is published, some of it's coming out, like this Catalyst article, right, on anti-slavery, really identifies this broader Civil War era as a time of, to use Frederick Douglass, I could call myself a Douglassist about this, as a time of struggle and progress, as a time when actually mass democratic politics combined with social movement struggle in the anti-slavery, the abolitionist and anti-slavery movement, combined with struggle from below in the 1860s on the part of enslaved people, actually produced a radical transformation in U.S. history that was not simply about, big capital calling the shots. The process of emancipation as it happened, the rise of the Republican Party, first of all, the rupture of the Union, the violent rupture of the Union, the process of emancipation on the ground, and the 13th and 14th Amendments in particular, none of those things were scripted by capital in any way that capital in the 1850s and 60s would have wanted to script them. They were all meaningful historical victories, I think, that the left should claim and own. Not that they brought in the millennium or accomplished the revolution in any final sense. Of course, it's struggle and progress, and then more struggle, and sometimes, defeat. We've just been talking about an era of defeat. The late 19th century was obviously another era of defeat that Douglass himself lived through before he died. So, the ball moves forward, the ball moves back. What I resist in sort of the Zinn school of history is the way in which so many of those moves seem to be almost pre-programmed by a certain kind of ideology. And there are other schools of sort of, I think, popular sort of progressive and liberal approaches to history now that aren't exactly Zinn-like, but I think share some of those same defects and sort of, anyway, but I know maybe you want to talk about that too.
Yeah, I was going to say, so, relatedly, a phenomenon that I feel like I have been observing recently, and I'm sure it's not new, and I'm sure this crops up on the right as well as on the left, but it's a tendency that I call, fake radical revisionist history. Perhaps there's a more elegant academic term for it, which you can comment on later. But it's basically the tendency to latch onto a myth or latch onto a piece of history that is just not true at all. And I'll give a few examples. So lots of people on the left really like or, have sort of propagated this idea that the Black Panther Party forced the government to either, adopt or expand its free breakfast program. And we actually talked about this when we had Amber Frost on the show. There's no historical basis to this. Obviously, the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program was amazing. It fed a lot of kids, but the federal free breakfast program was in existence long before, and its expansion was well underway when the Panthers launched their program. But I think why people gravitate to this is because, of course, Hoover was, watching the Black Panthers and kind of identified the free breakfast program as something that he thought was uniquely dangerous. And then after the Black Panthers sort of, brought out their program, the US government officially adopted an expansion of the federal free breakfast program. But as I say, it had been in the works before. And just to use another example, a few years ago, a lot of, progressive Asian American activists who wanted to sort of express support and solidarity for Black Lives Matter were saying, we need to stand in solidarity with Black people because Black activists in the 60s fought for us to be here, basically. They pushed the 1965 Immigration Act. And again, that, there are some strains of truth there, but that's just not true. The 1965 Immigration Act was this top-down measure, which, very broadly was sort of adopted as, I guess, a geopolitical consideration. The US government at the time, wanted to look a little bit less racist. And so that was one of the measures that they sort of put forward. Now, of course, during the 60s, you also have the Black Power movement, or again, the Black Panthers, who are really interested in third world liberation and third world solidarity. And that may have played, some role in shaping the culture. But reforming immigration was just not a plank of the civil rights movement. And so I bring up these examples because I actually feel a little uncomfortable saying they're not true, because I feel that they're very sort of dear to a certain quarter of the left, right? And I can see why. I think lots of people think that they're politically expedient. I think that they seem, very evocative in some ways. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this trend, or, this sort of move toward, fake radical history. If you've noticed this, and if you think there is any kind of expediency to this, or should we try to get the record straight?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, the trend that you're talking about is a little different from the one that I was kind of thinking about in terms of the way that history, the politics of history seem to work kind of in the liberal and progressive imagination more mainstream. I think those examples that you brought up are and maybe I'll come back to that, but those examples that you brought up are kind of They're in some ways I'm less unsympathetic to them than I am to other forms of sort of historical mischaracterization, in the sense that they're basically usable pasts that various activists and various sort of activists and people engaged in political struggle are just plucking at will from the treasure chest of history to sort of advance their point. And while I don't think I think that for one, on the left, we have responsibility to be rigorous in our plucking, and to hold those those treasure coins to the light and say, wait a minute, did this really happen in the way that this happened? Because if it didn't, then you're suggesting that we go down that in a sense all we have to do is follow a strategy that actually didn't produce results. So I think we need to be rigorous intellectually about it, about thinking about historical analogies. But in some ways, I'm less I don't have such a big problem with various kinds of sort of overenthusiastic uses of kind of movement history to say, hey, wait a minute, we did this. These activists did this then, and we can do this now, and that shows the power and possibility of social struggle. Because I feel like the dominant trend in so many ways is actually moves in the other direction, that sort of puts this big blanket of kind of continuity and what the historian James Oakes has called kind of racial consensus history, overlays on top of all struggles and all struggle and progress in U.S. history, from slavery through to the civil rights movement, and in fact actually sort of submerges any possibility of extracting either sort of lessons or inspiration or meaning from so many of those struggles, except as kind of heroic, noble, tragically doomed efforts that to battle against the sort of the white supremacist consensus that has governed everything from the beginning and always will. I mean, obviously, this is you see a version of this in the 1619 Project to some extent, or at least some portions of that of that production. But I think that's a kind of political temperament that I think actually has become quite popular within certain strands of sort of mainstream liberalism, because it works well both ideologically and materially with liberalism's insistence that a certain kind of moderate liberalism's insistence that like X and Y isn't possible. We're familiar with this in the Bernie camp, veterans of the Bernie campaign are familiar with that kind of logic, and I think it's really expanded to kind of a big reading of American history in which that actually there are these sort of fake radical examples that some on the left in little quadrants will bring out to sort of rah, but I think the stronger impulse right now is actually to sort of is to sort of call up history primarily as a chronicle of defeat, retreat, and actually almost impossibility, the kind of the permanence of this sort of like 400-year order in the U.S. in particular, and the kind of the way in which current events, present day struggles about wealth and power and capitalism and police violence and criminal justice and everything in the news today are just simply sort of echoes of a historical process 400 years ago or 200 years ago that have already basically predetermined this. And, I don't want to say that there's no power in that kind of history too, but I think on the left, we have to be really wary of this kind of originalism and the way that it sort of like disfigures and disempowers contemporary politics. To me, that's more dangerous than sort of one-off unrigorous uses of sort of movement history, which are not good. Obviously we should get the facts right, but I think that in some ways that's less of a problem than this other tendency, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you saw the thing with James Clyburn talking about FDR saying, I don't want Biden to be like FDR. I want him to be more like Truman, because Truman was a anti-racist crusader, as we all know. But that was just an interesting moment of why he felt the need to disassociate the legacy of FDR.
Right. That is, again, it does come down to these two big, really three big movements in, of major social, if you will, revolutionary change in U.S. history: Civil War era, the New Deal era, and then the sort of 60s civil rights era. And I think for certain figures, of different ideological, temperaments, the idea of kind of downplaying Even though I think there are counter tendencies, like I said, I did point to that, that Bowie column actually was heartening to see. But I think there are other segments, of course, on the sort of liberal left that are significantly invested in, undermining the New Deal as a sort of usable past in any sense for actually reactionary reasons in Clyburn's case, to say that, we would want Trumanism instead of Rooseveltism, on civil rights grounds is just perplexing. Yeah.
So I think my final question for you has to do with your own research. You had mentioned that you're writing, or you have a Catalyst article that's forthcoming on the mass politics of anti-slavery in the antebellum period. And to bring up Eric Foner again, he always talks about how Reconstruction is kind of an era that the left should study for sort of lessons on, not just ideology, but also strategy. So give us the kind of quick and dirty of the anti-slavery movement and mass politics in that era, and what you think the left can kind of take. Like, are there certain events or even publications or like people from that era that we should be looking at? And I ask specifically because, of course, abolition, in the period you're looking at, it's abolition of slavery, of course, but that is a hugely important and powerful sort of movement that I think a lot of people kind of look to again and again. We hear the word abolition surfacing again now, of course. People talk about abolishing ICE or, abolishing prisons or the police. So what can we learn about what you've just written about?
Yeah, this is my other, I guess this is my, to some extent, my other kind of historical analogy, my attempt at inspiration or usable past here, instead of the Gilded Age, to think about the, the antebellum and Civil War era struggle against the power of slavery. I think the way that I see this history is that, for the first, and this is my first book, is about this, is for the first, century of its existence, basically, or, 3/4 centuries of its existence, the national power of the United States was in the hands of the slaveholding class. And this was obviously and we could, I'm not going to get into the details of how that power was wielded through the Democratic Party, through sort of certain provisions of the Constitution, et cetera. People are probably familiar with a lot of this stuff. But the slaveholding class was, depended obviously on, racialized chattel slavery of African Americans. It also depended and identified itself on as sort of holding on to a certain kind of class power. And the anti-slavery movement, when it emerged into mass politics in the 1850s, time and time again identified the slaveholding class as a class, and actually did operate through a certain kind of very conscious class politics. Identifying the master class with the lords of the lash alongside the lords of the loom, as Charles Sumner would talk about, and others talk about slaveholding capitalists, identifying the master class as a literal 1%, about 300,000 slaveholders. There were about 300,000 slaveholders in a republic of about 30 million people. And they pointed this out again and again, that the way in which this oligarchic class power had throttled the federal government, was driving down the material prospects of, northern workers, whether their capacity to sort of own property or their capacity to, earn higher wages through a variety of means. They tied these kind of material issues to the moral injustice and criminality of slavery itself. And then ultimately, in the course of winning a presidential election and touching off the Southern reaction, that struggle was joined by in mass millions of enslaved workers in the South, hundreds of thousands of whom fought in the army that achieved their own liberation. So this is, to me, this is the most revolutionary moment in U.S. history. The American emancipation in global terms is probably second to Haiti, the most revolutionary process that we know of in the broad 19th century world. And it was violent, it was sudden, it was uncompensated, and it produced a political system and a political order in which formerly enslaved people were working in coalition with the ruling party almost immediately upon their emancipation. And in fact, were, in some cases, incorporated into the political system and holding major positions of power within those societies in which they were formerly enslaved. That happened nowhere else in some ways, it didn't even happen in Haiti, where the post-revolutionary situation gave way to dictatorship very quickly. So this is a unique and actually, almost I don't want to say exceptional, because that's a dangerous word for American historians to use, but I think there is something exceptional about the Civil War era. And my feeling is that it was driven, we need to remember, this was driven by a conscious political movement. This wasn't something that just sort of happened because of, various material thrummings within capitalism in the mid 19th century, and it sort of had to play out this way. The material conditions set the terms for what was operated, in which the political movements could operate. As Marx says, we make our history, but not in the ways that we choose. And so it's not like every option was on the table, but within those material frameworks, a conscious political movement, the anti-slavery movement, worked its way through social movements into mass politics, took control of the government, fought had a brutal and bloody collision with its antagonists, and produced a revolutionary outcome. So anyone who's interested in something like revolution, anyone who's interested in something like major left-wing, transformations in politics, in society, massive redistributions of wealth, the power of democracy to sort of overcome the entrenched rule of class and property and an oligarchic few. In all of those ways, this era is incredibly rich. As an incredibly rich resource for us to study. It doesn't have all the answers. In particular, I don't think, despite the sort of class politics rhetoric against the slaveholders of the 1850s, I don't think it actually provides a window into contemporary working class struggle or labor or the struggles of organized labor, which are so vital today. So it's not a one-to-one fit. Nothing ever is. But in terms of particularly on the question of how democracy can be, the field of democracy can be a site of struggle for major egalitarian change, even revolutionary change, then we need to study this for sure.
Pretty good pitch.
I actually have one last question. Can you actually recite the Gettysburg Address while drunk? That's something that producer Kale has accused you of. Confirm or deny? I
mean, I think it's kind of that was the first thing I did in my job interview at Princeton. They took me out into the quad, and Sean Wilentz, put an old pistol to my head and said, "Or
gave you some shots."
That was it.
That part will only be for
otherwise, frankly. Yeah,
that part will only be for patrons. You'll have to pay for that one.
I think that's pretty much all we have for you, Matt. We've kept you on for an hour, and we could go on, but I think for now we'll let you go. But thank you so much for coming on to the Jacobin Show. We'll have to have you back. I know you're a regular on this channel, but please rejoin us again.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, as Kale pointed out, my total butchery of that Marx quote shows that I'm totally out of gas and need to eat dinner. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Matt. We'll see you soon.